Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. The week I spent on the road hauling timber out past Springfield wasn't supposed to be anything but routine. Just me, the open highway, and the quiet hum of a job that paid the bills. When I finally rolled back into our small Missouri town, something about home felt different. The lights were on, the dishes done, and Lindsay, my wife, greeted me at the door with that usual tired smile of hers. But there was a shift I couldn't quite place. It wasn't obvious. No lipstick on a collar, no perfume that didn't belong. But the little things? They screamed louder than any confession. The photos on the mantel had been rearranged, as if someone new had spent too long staring at them. A subtle scent of fresh cologne hung in the air. Not mine, not even close. And Lindsay's phone, usually left on the kitchen counter when I was home, never left her pocket, vibrating quietly every now and then. I watched as her eyes darted toward it more than once, fingers twitching like she was itching to check it, but didn't dare. I could have ignored it, told myself it was nothing. But I knew better. You don't grow up in a town this small without learning how to read people, and I knew Lindsay like I knew the back of my own hand. Or at least I thought I did. That night, we sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the fields like we always did. Lindsay sipped her sweet tea, quiet, staring off into the distance like she was looking for an exit sign. I joked about the broken fence needing fixing, about Farmer Hill's cow wandering into the road again. She laughed, but it wasn't the real kind. It was brittle, hollow. I noticed how she flinched slightly when I mentioned our neighbor, Craig, from 2 doors down, who used to borrow tools from me like clockwork. She asked if I'd seen him lately. Odd question, since Craig had left town for good 3 months ago. I played dumb, shook my head, and changed the subject. The days rolled on, but that unease clung to me. Lindsay's routine shifted just enough to keep me guessing. More late evenings, more talk about helping out a coworker with overtime projects that conveniently started after sundown. The name she tossed around was harmless enough. Chad, someone she'd known for years. Nothing about him had ever raised a flag before. But it wasn't Chad that bothered me. It was the way Lindsay spoke of him, like she was forcing his name into conversation, like she was covering tracks no one had even followed yet. By midweek, I decided to visit her at work unannounced, just to bring her lunch. Something couples do all the time, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I got there, Chad wasn't in sight. Instead, it was a quiet intern, barely old enough to rent a car, who mentioned Lindsay had stepped out for a quick errand nearly 2 hours earlier. I left the sandwiches on her desk, but not before noticing a second coffee cup, half drunk, resting on the corner. I knew Lindsay hated coffee unless it was drowning in sugar and cream. This one was black. I drove home that evening with more questions than I started with. I didn't want to believe it. I wasn't the jealous type, but nothing about this felt right. As I stood in the doorway that night, watching Lindsay hum to herself while folding laundry, I realized something had shifted in our quiet little world. Something was about to break. It was 2 days later when the first crack widened, subtle but sharp as a splinter. Lindsay had left early for one of her mysterious work sessions, leaving me alone with the dull hum of the house. I wasn't looking for anything in particular when I wandered into the guest room. The room she swore was just for storage, but something about the door being slightly ajar caught my attention. The smell hit me first, faint but distinct, like cedarwood and leather, not the usual lavender detergent she used. My gut tightened. I flipped on the light and scanned the room. At first glance, it was just boxes and old linens, but tucked neatly behind the winter coats was a small, polished bag, the kind you'd use for a gift. I knelt down and tugged it free, my hands already shaking, knowing whatever was inside wasn't for me. Inside was a brand new pocket knife, a custom one, engraved with the initial CL. Not JL, not Jake. CL, whoever CL was. Lindsay had taken the time to pick out a high-end, handcrafted knife and have it engraved. And what stuck in my throat, even harder, was the note folded beneath it, half scribbled and hurried. For all those late nights, you make it worth it. My heart hammered in my chest. I stood there in silence, staring at the note as if reading it again would make it disappear. I could have marched straight to her job and demanded answers, could have torn through the house flipping every drawer, but instead I slid the note back, tucked the knife inside, and calmly resealed the bag. But I wasn't leaving it untouched. That night, after Lindsay drifted off to sleep, I slipped into the guest room with a fine nail file and went to work. The smooth edge of the blade was no more. I dulled it, not enough to be noticed at first glance, but enough to turn it useless for anything more than show. Then I pressed just hard enough on the engraved initials to scuff them, making the lettering faint and uneven. It was childish, maybe, but I needed the satisfaction. When Lindsay woke up the next morning, she was chipper. Too chipper. She moved around the kitchen with a spring in her step, humming to herself as if the universe hadn't shifted under my feet. I sipped my coffee, watching her, noting every glance at her phone, every nervous flick of her eyes toward the clock. I said nothing. I wanted to see how far she would go. That evening, she returned home noticeably frustrated. She barely touched her dinner, mumbled something about supplies being delayed and last-minute changes to some project. I almost smiled. Whatever she had planned with that gift had clearly gone sideways, but she hadn't the faintest idea why. I let her stew in it. I let her think it was just bad luck or poor timing. I didn't confront her. I didn't even bring up the guest room. Instead, I started paying closer attention to the patterns. Late-night texts, the sudden interest in wearing makeup just to organize inventory at work, excuses that grew thinner and thinner by the day. But Lindsay wasn't dumb. She was careful, calculated. Every lie she told was wrapped up neatly in a bow, like she had practiced them in the mirror. Yet none of it mattered. I had seen the gift. I had felt the shift. And now, I wasn't going to let it go. For the next few days, I pretended nothing had changed. I played the part of the easygoing husband. I listened to her ramble about work, nodded along when she mentioned the grain mill needing some old equipment fixed, and never once did I hint at what I had found. But inside, I was watching, waiting. Every slip of her tongue, every nervous laugh, every night she came home a little too late with excuses that didn't add up, I filed it all away. And she never noticed. Not once. A week went by, and with every sunset, my patience stretched thinner. Lindsay's routine had morphed into something unrecognizable. She was too cheerful when she left for work, too detached when she returned. There were evenings when she'd sit across from me at the dinner table, nodding absent-mindedly to whatever small talk I tossed out, but her eyes never really landed on me. It was like watching someone act in a play they didn't believe in anymore. Still, I bit my tongue and played along. It wasn't until Thursday night that I got my first lead. After another one of her late returns, I noticed a peculiar text flash across her phone as she left it charging on the kitchen counter. She must have thought I was asleep, but I'd been sitting quietly in the darkened living room nursing a beer. The message read, "Still good for Friday? Same place." My chest tightened. The sender's name read Chris, someone I vaguely knew from town, a harmless sort who ran the feed store. My stomach dropped, realizing this could be it. The missing piece. Was Chris the one Lindsay had been sneaking off with all along? The next morning, I drove down to the feed store under the guise of needing supplies for the garden. Chris was there, sweeping the porch, looking about as harmless as ever. I struck up casual conversation, playing dumb, even poking fun at how busy Lindsay had been lately. His reaction wasn't what I expected. He looked genuinely confused, even a little concerned. "Jake, I haven't seen Lindsay in months," he chuckled. "Not since the fall harvest party." He wasn't lying. You could see in the way he scratched the back of his neck, puzzled. I laughed it off, made small talk, then left with a sack of fertilizer I didn't even need. I sat in my truck outside the store for a long while, staring down at the steering wheel. If it wasn't Chris, then who the hell was she meeting? Had Lindsay intentionally saved the contact under his name to throw me off? My stomach churned. I drove around town for the rest of the day, going through every possibility, every face that had ever shared a smile too easily with her, every casual acquaintance. Nothing felt right. That night, I confronted her, not with the truth but with bait. I mentioned running into Chris. I watched her face carefully. She barely flinched. "Oh, I haven't seen him in forever," she said nonchalantly, taking a sip from her wine. That was when I knew. She wasn't careless. She was deliberate. She wanted me looking in the wrong direction, doubting the wrong people, wasting my energy chasing shadows. I pushed further. Funny, he said the same thing about you. Her eyes flickered for the briefest second, a crack in the porcelain. But then she smiled. Small town rumors, Jake. You know how they are. She stood up, collected the dishes, and hummed a tune as she walked into the kitchen like the conversation had never happened. I stared at the empty chair where she had sat, realizing how deep the deception ran. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch, watching the stars fade into the gray of dawn, knowing I had misjudged her completely. Lindsay wasn't some overwhelmed woman making poor decisions. She was calculated. Every move she made was measured. I'd accused the wrong man, fallen right into her script, and she hadn't even broken a sweat. But now I wasn't just suspicious. I was determined. The next time she slipped up, I'd be ready. No more guessing. It was early the next week when I noticed the pattern shift again. Lindsay began leaving earlier in the mornings, claiming the office needed her help sorting some grant paperwork ahead of schedule. I knew the routine well enough to know it was nonsense. The grant paperwork didn't come through until late spring, and we were barely into March. Still, I played dumb, kissed her goodbye every morning, and watched her drive off with that same shaky smile like she was trying to convince herself more than me. Something was brewing, and this time I wasn't going to be left in the dark. By Tuesday, I started trailing her. Not every day, just enough to pick up the trail without raising suspicion. She didn't go to the office. She didn't even head into town most mornings. Instead, she'd drive out past the edge of town toward the old grain mill. The same mill that had been practically abandoned since the new processing facility opened up last year. I followed from a distance, keeping my truck hidden behind tree lines and dirt mounds. She'd park around the back, out of sight from the main road, and disappear inside for hours. No signs of Chad or anyone else, but I knew someone was meeting her there. The tension gnawed at me. I wanted to storm in, demand answers, drag the truth out of her. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not without knowing exactly who. That night, Lindsay waltzed into the house humming again, setting the table like she hadn't just spent half the day sneaking around in the shadows. I played along. Busy at work, I asked, stirring the chili. She nodded too quickly. Oh yeah, tons of paperwork, she said without blinking. I watched her closely as she moved around the kitchen. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and when I pressed a little more, she changed the subject faster than a cat dodging water. By the way, the county fair's coming up, she added with a forced brightness. We should go. I pretended to consider it. Deep down, I knew she had no interest in spending time with me there. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a cover. She was planting seeds. The next day, I decided to do some digging on the mill itself. I called up Tom Greer, who used to handle maintenance for the place before it shut down. Over coffee at the diner, Tom mentioned, "Funny thing, Jake. Heard someone's been using the old office section. Folks assumed it was some kids messing around, but there's been fresh tire tracks out there nearly every other day." He leaned in a little. "Saw someone sneaking in myself once. Looked like a woman, but couldn't make out who." My stomach nodded. I thanked him and left before finishing my coffee. Back at home, I couldn't help but notice how Lindsay had suddenly become affectionate again, like she was sensing that I might be pulling away. She draped herself over me that night on the couch, forcing small talk and making light of everything, but it felt hollow, like she was performing. Later, as she showered, I searched through her car. I found nothing. No receipts, no stray notes, no signs of another man. Just the usual clutter. But tucked into the glove compartment was an old grain mill key, rusted and worn. I stared at it for a long while. It wasn't marked. It wasn't supposed to be there. Yet there it was right under my nose. I slipped it back into place and shut the compartment, heart pounding. I had no absolute proof yet, but I knew I was standing on the edge of it. Lindsay's lies were piling up faster than she could cover them, and with every passing day, I could feel her slipping deeper into whatever web she thought she was weaving. The only question now was, how much longer until it snapped? By Friday, I was a walking storm, quiet on the surface, but ready to crack the sky wide open. I spent the morning watching Lindsay as she rushed around, stuffing paperwork and receipts in her bag like she was genuinely in a hurry. "Don't wait up," she said with a weak grin, brushing past me and heading out the door. The moment the tail lights vanished down the road, I grabbed my keys and followed, staying far enough back that she wouldn't spot me. She drove straight to the old grain mill without hesitation, like she'd done it 100 times. But this time, I wasn't staying hidden in the woods. I waited until she disappeared inside, then quietly circled around the side of the building, finding a gap between the boards where I could see through. Inside, I spotted her pacing nervously, checking her phone repeatedly, but no one else was in sight. I crouched there, holding my breath, wondering if this would finally be the moment I'd see the other half of the betrayal. After what felt like hours, the side door creaked open, and in stepped Chad. My stomach turned. It wasn't just the fact that it was Chad, it was how casual they were, how familiar. He barely had the door shut before she greeted him with a smile that I hadn't seen directed at me in months. My fists clenched at my sides, but I stayed hidden, watching as they talked softly, their words muffled by the old wood. They pulled out blueprints, likely the same renovation plans Lindsay had been rambling about during dinners. My heart thudded heavier with each second. I stayed frozen there, watching as Lindsay laughed at something Chad said, leaning closer than necessary, her body language screaming intimacy. Yet, strangely, nothing overt happened. No kiss, no touch beyond the professional, but the way they looked at each other said everything. That look wasn't about business. It was the kind you only share when you've already crossed lines you can't uncross. I pulled away from the gap and paced through the trees, rage bubbling just beneath the surface. There was no denying it now. Lindsay wasn't just working late or helping a coworker. She was sharing something with Chad, something I hadn't been invited to. Yet still, I didn't storm in. I didn't make a scene. I realized then that anger wasn't enough. I wanted them to feel what I felt, slow and suffocating. That evening, Lindsay returned home like nothing had happened. She reheated leftovers and asked about my day as if we were still playing house. I answered in short, calm responses, nodding when appropriate, smiling when expected. Deep down, though, I was plotting. Every time she glanced down at her phone or nervously tucked her hair behind her ear, I cataloged it. She didn't notice that I had stopped looking at her the way I used to. She didn't notice that I was already miles away from this marriage. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The anger had already begun to harden into resolve. I wasn't going to fight for her attention. I wasn't going to beg for explanations. I was going to walk away with my pride intact and make sure that when the truth finally shattered over her, she'd remember every single moment of it. I could almost hear the grain mill creaking in the distance, like it too was waiting for the inevitable. The following week unfolded like a cruel joke. Lindsay floated through our home, humming as she packed lunches, folded laundry, and chatted about county fair preparations as if nothing in the world was wrong. But behind her sunny facade, I could see it. The guarded glances, the half-hearted affection, the tension barely hidden beneath her rehearsed smiles. I went along with it all, every nod and chuckle, nothing more than a mask, while beneath it I was sharpening a plan, cold and deliberate. I had stopped searching for evidence. I didn't need to anymore. I already knew. What I needed now was to let it all bloom at the perfect moment. It was during dinner when she casually mentioned, "Oh, Chad's been needing extra help getting the fair setup ready." Poor guy stretched thin. I nearly choked on my food, but kept it down, giving nothing away. "That's so," I replied, pretending to be absorbed in the mashed potatoes. She rambled on about how they'd be spending more time out near the fairgrounds and might even help decorate the old mill as part of the theme. She said it like she was explaining some last-minute community project. But I knew better. I could almost admire how deep she was willing to dig the hole. The next day, I made my move. I took off work early, drove out past the fairgrounds, and parked behind a patch of trees where I could see the grain mill from a distance. Hours passed, but eventually, just like clockwork, Lindsay's car pulled up. She wasn't alone. Chad's beat-up truck followed close behind. They both slipped inside through the same side door I'd seen her use before. My pulse raced, but I stayed put, watching as the shadows behind the grimy windows played out their scenes. I moved carefully around the side, slipping between the old silos and broken fence posts until I could peer through a gap in the boards. What I saw confirmed every suspicion and yet still hit harder than I expected. There they were, laughing, setting up decorations, arranging chairs, but there was no one else, no other volunteers. Just them. The two of them looked like they'd rehearsed this scene a dozen times already. Chad adjusted Lindsay's scarf like he had every right to, lingering far too long. Lindsay giggled, brushing his hand away, but not before squeezing it. The small touches were worse than anything else. They weren't just betraying me. They were comfortable with it. But still, I didn't move. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my fist tight enough to make my knuckles ache. I knew exactly who it was now. I knew where they did it. And watching them in that abandoned mill, decorating like they were preparing for some private celebration, made it clear they were planning more than just a few stolen moments. The pieces came together. The extra shifts, the fairground excuses, the late nights. This wasn't a fling. It was an arrangement built brick by brick in the shadows. Yet I didn't burst through the door. I didn't yell. I turned and walked away, leaving them to their little bubble of secrecy. Because I wasn't about to ruin the moment. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. I had something else in mind, something far more satisfying. That night, Lindsay returned home just as chipper, dropping her keys on the counter like it was any other day. "Fair's shaping up nicely," she said, sliding next to me on the couch. I simply nodded, staring at the TV, though I didn't see a single frame. I'd already left that couch, that room, that entire life behind. Lindsay had no idea. No clue that I'd seen everything. No idea that I was done playing along. And certainly no idea that by the time the fair rolled around, I wouldn't be the one embarrassed. She would be. The week leading up to the county fair passed like a fever dream. Lindsay was a whirlwind of excitement, busying herself with decorations, meetings, and late nights at the mill. She chatted endlessly about how important this year's fair would be for the town, how proud she was of the work everyone had done. I smiled, nodded, and encouraged her every step of the way. Inside, I was stitching together the final seams of a plan she would never see coming. On Wednesday, I paid a quiet visit to the Hillcrest Lodge just off Route 9, a small but well-known spot for fairgoers to crash after long nights of rides and fireworks. I booked a room, no questions asked, and then spent the afternoon at the diner where I'd first noticed Molly and Jess weeks ago. Two sisters who had recently moved into town, bright-eyed and sharp-tongued. They stood out in the sea of familiar faces. I'd caught them exchanging glances with me before, subtle but telling. This time, I didn't just return the glances. I invited myself into their booth. We talked for hours. About the fair, the town, even about the grain mill's ghost stories. They laughed, I laughed, and before the sun dipped behind the hills, they had agreed to meet me again during the fair. No strings, no pressure. Just company. Perfect. By Friday night, the fairgrounds were buzzing. The scent of kettle corn, barbecue, and funnel cakes filled the air as the ride spun and the stage lit up with live music. Lindsay was everywhere, charming townsfolk, directing volunteers, stealing glances at Chad when she thought no one was looking. I leaned against the fence, hands in my pockets, observing it all like an outsider watching a play where he already knew the ending. I didn't interfere. I didn't make a scene. I even smiled when she waved at me from across the crowd, acting like the perfect, supportive husband. But my mind was already at the lodge, knowing full well what would come next. The next morning, as dawn painted the sky soft orange, I strolled out of the Hillcrest Lodge's front door alongside Molly and Jess. We were dressed casually, carrying leftover fair prizes and laughing over some inside joke they made about the town's obsession with pie contests. I didn't have to search the parking lot to know Lindsay would be there. And there she was, standing stiff as a statue by her car, coffee in hand, staring wide-eyed as we emerged. I gave her a casual wave, a grin that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Morning," I said, loud enough for her to hear over the gravel crunching underfoot. She blinked, mouth opening but no words coming out. The sisters, none the wiser, waved politely and walked ahead, leaving me standing there in the fresh morning air, savoring the sight. "You weren't the only one working late," I added, tilting my head, watching the weight of the words hit her like a sack of bricks. She didn't respond. Couldn't. Her face paled, her fingers tightened around the coffee cup until the lid nearly popped off. Around us, Early fairgoers and lodge guests began to notice. Eyes darted between us, whispers already brewing. It was subtle but enough. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to accuse. The story had already written itself, and the whole town would be reciting it by sundown. I left her standing there as I walked toward my truck, not a single ounce of regret clinging to me. Molly and Jess waved from the passenger seat as I started the engine. I caught Lindsay's stunned, humiliated expression one last time in the rearview mirror. It was done. The town wouldn't be talking about me anymore. They'd be talking about her and Chad. It didn't take long for Lindsay to come knocking. By Sunday afternoon, just as I'd expected, she showed up at the house uninvited, pounding on the front door like the world was ending. I could see her through the window, hair disheveled, mascara smudged, panic written all over her face. I let her knock twice more before finally opening the door, leaning casually against the frame, arms crossed, letting the silence between us stretch. "Jake, please," she blurted out, stepping in without permission, eyes darting around the living room like she was searching for the version of me she could still manipulate. "We need to talk. Whatever you think you saw, it's not what it looks like." I closed the door behind her, but stayed rooted. "Go on," I said, my voice cold, steady. She wrung her hands, pacing back and forth, throwing out half-baked explanations about stress, late nights, community projects, everything but the truth. The desperation was thick. She wasn't here because she regretted what she'd done. She was here because the town was buzzing, and she knew exactly who they were buzzing about. I made mistakes," she stammered. "I was overwhelmed. I didn't think I'd find out." I cut in sharply. She flinched, tears welling up immediately, but I didn't budge. "No sympathy, no softening." "Jake, please, I was scared," she whimpered. "I was worried about us, about you always being distant, about work, about everything." I couldn't help but laugh, bitter and hollow. "You're really going to stand there and blame this on me? Because I worked late? Because I trusted you?" I shook my head slowly. "I wasn't distant, Lindsay. I was just too blind to see you for what you were." The tears came harder then. She collapsed onto the couch like some tragic heroine, sobbing into her hands, pleading. "I don't want to lose you," she said between gasps. "I love you. You're the only person who's ever mattered to me. We can fix this, Jake. We can go to counseling. We can know." I snapped, cutting her off mid-sentence. "There's no fixing this." He stepped closer, towering over her. "You knew exactly what you were doing every single time you walked into that mill. Every text you sent, every lie you told. It wasn't some heat-of-the-moment mistake. It was a choice. You chose him. You chose to make me look like a fool. And now you're only sorry because everyone else knows." Her sobs quieted, and she stared up at me, wide-eyed and trembling. But I was done. I had nothing left to give her. Not pity, not anger, not forgiveness. Nothing. "Get out," I said simply. She sat frozen, blinking like she hadn't heard me right. "What?" "You heard me," I repeated. "Get out." When she didn't move, I walked over, grabbed her coat from the chair, and tossed it beside her. "You don't live here anymore. You don't belong here." She stood slowly, like her legs might give out, and reached for me one last time. "Jake, please, just listen to me. I've listened enough," I said, stepping back. "I hope you and Chad have a wonderful life." Her face crumbled, but I didn't flinch. I opened the door, letting the cold air rush in. She stood there for a long, pitiful moment before finally grabbing her coat and stepping outside. I closed the door behind her without another word, without regret. As I leaned against it, hearing her car sputter to life and fade down the road, I realized the silence inside the house wasn't empty. It was peaceful. The following weeks rolled in quietly, the silence of the house no longer feeling like a void, but more like a deep breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Without Lindsay's constant chatter, excuses, and fabricated busyness, I found myself rediscovering things I had long since shelved away. I spent mornings on the porch watching the fog lift off the fields, afternoons tinkering with old tools in the shed, and evenings visiting the diner where Molly and Jess had quickly become familiar company. The town, of course, had wasted no time. Whispers followed me like dust on the wind, but this time they weren't pitiful. They weren't aimed at me. They circled around Lindsay and Chad, who were now the reluctant stars of every conversation from the grocery store to the church potlucks. People gave me nods of understanding, even sympathy, but I didn't need it. I wasn't broken. I wasn't some wounded animal limping through town. I was just free. Molly and Jess started inviting me to small get-togethers. Nothing fancy, just bonfire nights and old country records spinning on portable players. They didn't press about Lindsay. They didn't ask for details. They just treated me like Jake, the guy who knew how to patch a fence and could make a mean apple cobbler if you bribed him enough. It was refreshing to be seen without the shadow of a marriage hovering over me. One evening, as we sat under the stars, Jess looked over and said, "You seem lighter." I chuckled, staring into the flames. I reckon I finally dropped some dead weight. They laughed, and for the first time in months, I felt it wasn't forced. As days turned to weeks, I threw myself into small projects. I fixed up the old barn, restored my father's fishing boat, and even started taking weekend trips out to neighboring towns just because I could. There was no one at home waiting with a passive-aggressive comment or a hollow smile. There was just me, and oddly enough, it felt good. Better than good. The hardest part wasn't losing Lindsay. It was realizing how long I had lived under the illusion that I needed her to be whole. The truth was, I hadn't been whole with her for years. I'd been managing, surviving under the weight of unspoken disappointments and quiet betrayals long before the grain mill ever entered the picture. Without her, I wasn't broken. I was finally unburdened. I heard Lindsay had moved out of town eventually, though I didn't ask for details. Someone at the diner mentioned seeing her loading a U-Haul and heading west, Chad trailing behind her like a lost dog. I didn't feel a thing. No anger, no satisfaction, just indifference. One morning, as I cast a line into the still waters of the lake, the sun warming my face, I realized that this peace was something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't Jake, the husband. I wasn't Jake, the betrayed. I was just Jake. And for the first time, that was enough. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.